Welcome to another episode of the Race Relations Podcast. I'm your host, Caleb Sinclair, and I have with me today, again, Dr. Horton. For those of you that didn't tune in maybe for the first episode, Dr. Horton is the director of the Masters of Psychology program at Seattle U. He is a dear friend and a mentor and just honestly a perfect person to have this conversation with because we have these conversations every week, honestly. And so I just want to first say thank you, sir, for coming back.
Well, thank you, Caleb, for your work. I'm delighted to be here.
Absolutely. And also, sorry that we couldn't get the whole thing in the first take. I think we're both trying to figure out.
That's on me as much as you, for sure.
Right. This whole podcast thing and how long it takes to actually try to, span this big of an issue, talking about violence. Right. And there's kind of the first take that we did was more talking about the overall system of white supremacy and how the whole ideology of white supremacy is that it provided white Europeans and then later Americans themselves, colonists and citizens, 400 years of ways to deny and excuse kind of the selfish economic motives associated with slavery, with colonization, with the seizure of indigenous lands, and this whole thing is wrapped up in, as we talked about in the first episode, Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste. And if for those of you that haven't read that book, please go read it. It's amazing. But what she kind of outlines in this book is that white supremacy is designed to be able to create this power system. Right, and it's designed, and the engine behind it, the vessel, is through racism. Right, that if as colonizers came over, they have this discussion of there's these people in this land, right, that are indigenous, and we have to be able to figure out a way to one, get them, out of our lands, right? To be able to get money, wealth and money, and then power, and then obviously property and these types of things. And then also having the thought of how are we going to get all of this going? Because we're just settlers, right? And so having the conversation of now we need to have slave labor. Okay, so we bring that in, right? And this is going to be the vessel. If we can now make it a norm that if you are white in any way, shade, or color of it, that you are in power, right? And then everyone below you is kind of feeding to you with money and resources, right? And so this has taken place through the Jim Crow era and has provided cover for mass incarceration, for police violence, for judicial bias, for gruesome forms of social and economic inequalities. And even now, we're now to this place where it's happening in our present day, and we're trying to reckon with how is it that this system has survived for so long, right? How is it that it seems like for so many people that white supremacy is not still living and breathing? Well, it's very intentional. Right? Yeah. You have to be able to create a system that's intentional, that is deniable to the mass populace, but also perceptible, but you can't work against it if you are people being oppressed by that actual system. Yeah. And so that's kind of where we talked about a lot about last episode.
Yeah. So that ideology, that white supremacist historical ideology that's been in place for hundreds of years in Europe and then brought over to the New World and, kind of instituted here, it's a way of just of locking in place over long periods of time, multiple generations, a kind of system of exploitation, dehumanization, providing a rationale for it, providing a justification for all manner of kind of gross, just transparent abuses, neglect, exploitation, injustices. And that system was really powerful, and it remains really powerful. Some of the tenets that we've talked about as kind of like being at the center of white supremacist ideology historically, that many of them carrying right down into the present through our institutions and kind of social arrangements. And it's kind of like in the air that we breathe in many ways. So some of the key tenets there that we've talked about. So slavery, European domination, white rule was claimed to be good for Black Africans and Native Americans, for instance.
Right.
It was claimed that people of color, Black Africans brought over as slaves, or Native Americans, were unfit to rule themselves. They required the help of Europeans to kind of be uplifted and civilized, brought into the proper kind of like moral faith of the version of Christianity that, that white supremacist values had already kind of like inflected and started to corrupt and undermine. You see as well, like, it's institutionally encoded in places, in all kinds of places in our political institutions and systems. The ideology required that basically that Black people, Native Americans should have no political vote and no voice and influence within the political system. And efforts to disenfranchise, disempower, or reduce the political voice and impact of persons of color persist to this day. And dozens of ways that we see every time we kind of check the news feed on kind of contemporary media. Other kind of facets of it, the claims of white supremacism that kind of go back a long, long ways would say that efforts at spending money and making efforts at education for persons of color and Black communities would be wasted. Instead, God has fitted persons of color for lesser occupations, for manual labor, but not elevated them to the status of white Europeans. And so you see a justification initially for first systems like, segregated education, where there's gross neglect and underinvestment or no investment at all of like state level, public level, federal monies into education of Black persons in this country. But you see it kind of prevailing right now in the way that we tolerate injustices in the funding of school districts, and resource allocation is based on property taxes and kind of like land ownership and local kind of cycles of prosperity, where white citizens have generational wealth accumulated and have enormous advantage, and the kind of recreation and throwing forward of these injustices just continues. One or two other things you could talk about would be the idea that there was a tenet that was like really strong in white supremacism that would say that in their ignorance, persons of color, Black persons, would only understand force and violence. And that that the kind of physical abuses and punishment and infliction of just horrible atrocities upon Black persons in this nation for hundreds of years was justified in these terms. You only understand force, and there's a dehumanizing kind of element of it that runs through like kind of all of these different tenets of white supremacism. But you see that playing forward in the kind of right now legal bias and procedures and abusive policing and protection of the violence that's routinely inflicted on Black-bodied persons in this country, to the large scale kind of sometimes indifference and non-reaction of large numbers of people in this society. So kind of all in all, the values of white supremacism asserted that persons of color were less than fully human, and certainly less than white European settlers, and and the framers of the Constitution, and and the people who were holding the strands and kind of guiding and able to exercise control over the formation of many of our kind of like social institutions, and this has created kind of a really toxic and destructive living legacy that's embodied in our institutions and our implicit assumptions, our values, and in the ideas that we might carry forward in ways that we might think or argue or kind of like fall into these kind of ways of seeing.
Yeah, and I think all of those tenets for me kind of lay the groundwork for, again, kind of this system that is supposed to justify, like you said, kind of violence, right, at large. So if black people or BIPOC people are, if we can make people, the mass populace, white mass populace, believe that they are only going to respond to a certain type of treatment, vis-a-vis being violent treatment throughout slavery, throughout genocide, and like we talked about, mass incarceration, policing, these different things, then we can normalize it. And it becomes very routine to where we don't even actually see or perceive it, white people, vis-a-vis the violence that is going on. And that leads to like this very vexing thing when we have this conversation of violence of like, many white people would actually roundly reject that this violence and we are living in violent times, and that especially now, post-slavery, where like violence was very visceral, that there is not violence permeating our society on a daily basis. Right. And this is very much incorrect. That, again, white supremacy was engineered to be our whole entire framework, from national political, economic, educational, legal, and medical systems. It's all integrated into these very powerful institutions that manage our well-being, right? And bringing, and again, it's something that sits sedimented, right? We're habitually conditioned to not believe that these systems exist, and so I think it's really interesting to kind of see and sit with, honestly, this podcast episode is based on, both of our episodes are based on kind of bringing to light, illuminating that invisible strand through kind of the works of psychology, social, and Albert Bandura.
Yeah. So I think the piece that we can bring to it, or that I feel like as a social cultural psychologist that I can bring to this one piece, is to kind of talk about a lot of really interesting research and understanding that's been done in the last 60 or 70 years. And Bandura's work is really at the center of the work of a lot of different researchers and different psychologists, but it gives us a way of kind of like of moving from the level of kind of like, okay, we have an ideology of white supremacism that persists in this country. Kind of it's in the air that we breathe. That's around us. It's embedded. Its values are embedded in institutions, and but we still have a problem in terms of like individual psychology. On one level or another, we have to be able to kind of like think about, explain, account for, and then try and actively engage with a problem, whereby we have so many white citizens of this country who would say, I don't believe in white supremacism. We read off, and I talked about that list of, these are assumptions that, that persons of color are less than fully human, or, educational resources or social resources would be poorly spent attempting to lift up persons who, persons from this particular background, for instance. White people would say, I don't believe that. No, that's not true. And and they personally don't want to kind of feel that there's somehow their actions are implicated in the kind of moving forward and the kind of the momentum of the system and the destruction that it causes. But so we have lots and lots of folks in this country, white folks who would say, I'm innocent. There's no blood on my hands here. I don't have a responsibility to act in this way. And that just kind of like seems like so difficult to account for when we have just a really clear documentation of injustices and persisting abuses and inequalities, and a historical record that testifies to to generations of political and social abuse and neglect, really actively. So how is it psychologically that that I can kind of sit here and kind of all Pontius Pilate, like kind of be hands. Like my hands are clean. Right. How does that kind of work, and how's that accomplished? Well, one of the things that this body of work in social psychology would suggest is that, and Albert Bandura's work is kind of like speaks directly to this, is the idea there's a common sense notion psychologically that we're all come into this world with a moral framework or a conscience, with a set of kind of ideas of what we consider right and wrong, appropriate behavior, inappropriate behavior, and that intuitively almost all of us, except for a very small segment of persons who we would say were sociopathic or very mentally ill or disturbed, would say that inflicting pain upon others, cruel conditions of life, directly abusing or hurting others, is unjust and a wrong behavior. And if I understand myself to be involved in or participating in that type of action, then I should feel guilt. I should feel remorse. I should feel, a sting of kind of conscience and consideration, and I should correct my behavior, or at least kind of like confront a set of kind of choices about what I need to do. And my self-esteem, if I carry forward in immoral behaviors, destructive behaviors to others, should suffer as a result. So that's a kind of common sense notion of the way our kind of moral conscience, judgment, and psychology should work. Well, Albert Bandura and others, kind of demonstrated that, in fact, it's not quite that simple. And as human beings, and not just white Americans, but persons of every background all over the world, that there's some reliable ways that people use, and groups of people when they get together can use, to basically kind of like turn off that part of their brain, that conscience, to kind of cross-wire it and disengage that sense of self-judgment or remorse or regret or shame. And Bandura calls these mechanisms of moral disengagement. And in one of the articles that we're going to be looking at, and hopefully we can provide a link to it, Bandura's written about this in many different contexts, but he kind of walks through these and describes them. And it's not all of it his own original research. It relies on the findings of kind of like dozens of other psychologists. But as you start to look at this and you look at these mechanisms of moral disengagement, these kind of like mental tricks and dodges that are available to us as human beings to kind of shut down our kind of sense of guilt, remorse, conscience, moral kind of empathy towards others. Compassion. Yeah, it's a direct kind of like way of kind of disengaging or overriding moments where we might feel a very deep and troubling sense of confusion
to the other person.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So we've got these mechanisms of moral disengagement, and we can walk through some of them. I think it's really valuable to kind of like talk about these with an understanding that, again, these are kind of universal, and these are things that that I find myself doing, and I know others do, and we can find examples of them kind of all across the world. It's not specific to one person, one set of people, or one situation. But one of the first ones, and one of the ones that Bandura emphasizes, is really central to our kind of capacity to kind of shut down our moral response, is one that he calls moral justification. And Bandura describes this as a mechanism whereby detrimental conduct or harmful conduct towards others that we might engage in is made acceptable by portraying it as serving morally or socially desirable purposes. So we end up arguing that we recognize that we're doing something kind of harmful, or we're going to tolerate and accept that this person over here is being injured by our actions because there's a greater moral good or purpose that's at stake here. And that moral good that we're serving, that end to which our actions are intended, justifies or necessitates the suffering of this other human being or this group. And when we think about like kind of arguments that take this form of moral justification, when we were talking about the ideology of white supremacy, you can see the whole framework of white supremacy is kind of designed to provide a kind of framework for moral justification, that slavery is for the benefit of Black Americans, that it's morally uplifting, that we really are pursuing what's best for ourselves or for our nation. There's any number of times where actions that would be really understandable as like kind of genocidal, ethnic cleansing, brutal forms of violence or oppression directed at others are justified in terms of these kind of grand moral claims that the sanctity of kind of like the larger human society depends upon us acting to to eradicate this group or to control them or to inflict, horrific conditions of life upon them. Otherwise, there's a kind of sickness or a contamination that will spread, that will, kind of overtake us, or our well-being will be in jeopardy, and the greater good of our society will be jeopardized. So that's just one of these mechanisms, and we can kind of jump in and riff off some of the other ones if that is.
I think I first want to kind of talk about. Wow, voice just went crazy there, live and direct. But I think one of the things where to start too is like this whole conversation of morality, right? And like how morality is in and of itself flawed because it changes, and it's very fluid based on what dominant culture is kind of setting what is morally good or just. Kind of like what you're saying here, of like where there's been times in U.S. history where white people, I mean, obviously throughout U.S. history, have been in power, and they've justified what their actions through bending morality, right? Through being able to contort it through propaganda, through the better goodment of people, right? So indigenous genocide, well, these people are quote unquote savages. Well, that's not true. But if we can spread that lie, then when we go and we destroy all of these people and we decimate their population, we're saying it's for the better goodment of the actual entire United States.
Yeah.
Right. And
that the U.S., kind of the project of creating the United States of America is a kind of unique historical mission that will be a city on the hill, that we're kind of God's chosen people, and that the necessity of kind of like establishing this kind of kingdom of righteousness and virtue, and protecting, kind of religious expression and freedoms, falls heavily upon the shoulders of the settlers, the white settlers of the United States. And it's imperative that this work move forward. And if other groups are kind of standing in the way, occupying lands that, that could productively be expanded into, that would kind of create the greater glory. The manifest destiny was the 19th century term that, was invoked over and over again for expansion and seizure of native lands, and kind of moving the kind of pace of settlement westward, then it was necessary. And it was a necessary, sometimes evil, but there were any number of kind of moral justifications. And you touched on a number of kind of these mechanisms of moral disengagement that depend upon dehumanizing and kind of like attacking the value of other groups and other persons. Right. So dehumanizing other individuals is one way, another mechanism of moral disengagement.
Right.
So you talked about language of savages.
Yeah, painting that picture of someone being a threat to your safety or security, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we see this very much, and not only as for indigenous people as savages, but black people as being, again, like less than human, as crazy as these animals, right? And depicting that as, well, we're exterminating these people, or we're creating servitude for these people to embetter them and our society as well. But it's really, again, all just about the power and the resources that can be pulled from that people to be able to actually justify the unjust treatment, the morally flawed treatment of these people. Yep. And we've seen this today. I was watching the news and the way that we change language. I was watching the news about the trial. I think Kyle, the teenager that killed all of the people in Wisconsin.
Right. Was that Rittenhouse?
Yeah, Rittenhouse, I believe. And how the judge, before even deciding what his trial was going to be, contorted the way that they were describing the people that they shot. So the judge said, no, we're not going to be able to call the people in the trial victims. They're only protesters and rioters. That's the only way that we can reference them. And what people don't understand is by doing that brief but very intentional psychological switch, you're taking compassion. Well, I'm more viscerally drawn to a person when I see victim, right? Yeah. And instead of rioter or a protester, because it's such a kind of if we don't understand the actual issue, why those people are out there, and it's been such a contentious issue, it again paints a different picture. Like, we're trying to humanize what Kyle did, right? Killing of people, violence, without remorse, versus the innocent victims that were actually a part of, trying to bring humanization to the people that were killed in the police killings, right? Processing a right and just cause. But that painting of that picture, that intentional painting, changing the language, is such a visceral thing that we would just think, twice of if we don't actually are drawn to, recognizing that.
Yeah, and the language, the kind of single word elements in this language, the difference between a rioter and a victim, it kind of pulls in a frame of interpretation with it that can be really powerful. And we saw it kind of back in a great example of it with Hurricane Katrina, where we had the photos of looters that were brought forward and run, where you had Black residents of flooded parishes and communities in New Orleans, taking food from stores because they're literally starving, and they have nothing. They're gonna die if they don't eat and provide so we had that framing that that kind of was put forward in the press there of these are looters, these people, which implies kind of like selfishness. They're illegally obtaining, acquiring, and we see that contrasted with the depictions of white persons who are needing to get food for their families, and kind of the portrayal of kind of like of innocent victimhood, or just a kind of a humane portrayal. But that powerful frame and the way that our language and the language that we use when we put forward representations in the media, but also when we're talking among ourselves and talking about our, kind of what we're up to and why, or somebody confronts us with something and asks us, why did you do that? Why do you think that's okay? The temptation to shift into that language. Well, they were rioting, and we had to control that situation, is really different from the language of, there were some young people and they were holding signs and they were saying police violence must end. They were protesting. Okay, that's thorny, and that gets into more of a kind of humanized frame where you're looking at another human being and you're not kind of moving to a frame of kind of threat. And here's somebody who's out of control, who's likely to only respond to, brutal assertion of force and control. A rioter is not going to stop when you say, hey, what, why are you doing this? And I need you to kind of slow this down. And but somebody who's engaged in a in kind of asking for changes and protesting might actually be willing to have a dialogue with you and to talk about kind of what they're asking for and why.
Correct.
So you throw in the rioter frame, and suddenly it's like nothing but plastic bullets and tear gas is going to be enough to stop this person. And over again, we kind of like get that shift in frames and rhetoric when we're looking at and talking about kind of actions, intentions, ascribed kind of motivations in this country of persons of color and Black Americans in particular.
Right. I think that that's something that people have to really pay attention to. I think often we think that language is not intentional, but it very much is, and it can, again, like you're saying, distort how we psychologically are thinking about and spreading that kind of compassion versus dehumanization, right? And actually triggering and watering the different gardens. I always try to have like this depiction of watering the two gardens, right? Like there's the kind of the non-violent garden. Thich Nhat Hanh actually talks about this, a Buddhist monk who is very kind of pro non-violence, having the two gardens of watering kind of the violent garden that is filled with kind of the guilt, the anger, the rejection, and then having this other garden that we have that is filled of compassion and love and empathy, and that is truly our actual nature. But again, it is a very intentional choice for us to do or to water one or the other. And if you water one more than the other, then you're more psychologically conditioned to be triggered by that particular garden, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. There's a really powerful effect, though. If you talk about two gardens, that garden that's the garden of kind of like threat, violence, control, kind of set of responses, is one that seems to be the stuff there seems to grow faster, and to take hold and give the same amount of time and attention to both. There seems to be some kind of like a flaw of human nature whereby we are more sensitized and we respond on sometimes like on a more visceral level to information or imagery that conveys a sense of danger or threat to ourselves. And maybe it's something, certainly a lot of psychologists would say that this is an evolutionarily kind of adaptive response that's kind of like wired into our nervous systems, our kind of ways of thinking and things like that. But when we're presented with a kind of frame that there's a threat out there, when something is framed as threatening to our well-being or to our safety or the safety of persons or things that we love, then that tends to kind of like take up all available space in our consciousness, and it kind of crowds out other perceptions, and we're kind of vulnerable to this. There's something about these kind of frames of danger and threat that are ultra powerful, and we've seen that. We certainly saw that during the Trump administration. The skill with which Trump himself and others in that administration would bring forward visceral imagery of the threats of Latino gang members who are supposedly crossing the borders in tens of thousands, and the language that's a good example of some of the other types of language we're talking about, where the framing of issues of illegal immigration into the country in the terms of dangerous individuals, not their best people, rapists, dangerous individuals, gang members who will commit murders, and then there's a simultaneous with that in the elaboration of this, and kind of persons who picked up this frame, they'll use the dehumanizing rhetoric where they'll talk about these groups of people who are coming in as representing a kind of virus or a kind of like a kind of that they're having an effect of destabilizing American society. That the rise in the rates of murders and violent crime in urban areas over a certain time frame is attributable directly to the kind of decay or the corrupting influence that comes in with this with the spread of this kind of process of immigration, and they're literally implicitly at different points kind of comparing immigration to persons to some form of contagious kind of dangerous carrier. Sometimes they've made explicit the argument that that immigrants are carrying it was HIV at one point. At this point, we've heard COVID and coronavirus kind of reference. Even when we had the circumstance where the COVID rates were much lower in Mexico and in Latin America than in the United States, illegal immigrations, it was being like, well, they're coming over the borders and they're spreading COVID, was being spread on major media outlets. And it's just kind of astounding. No, they're coming over the border and they're at 10 times greater risk now of being exposed to COVID by virtue of being in the United States than they were, when they were, kind of when a person was settled stably in an urban area in Central America. But this kind of like dehumanizing rhetoric and frame and using this language is just really powerful in kind of motivating and justifying kind of violent responses, control, many different kinds of outcomes. Right.
Yeah. I think that's, again, just paying attention to that intentional language is so important. I think another moral, mechanism that he talks about is distancing ourselves from the effects of our actions. So avoiding information about the harms we inflicted on others, looking away, isolating ourselves from those we injure so we don't have to confront them in humanity and suffering. And this one, my voice is crazy today. Give me 1 second here.
We'll cut this out if you just want to cough it out for a minute there.
My voice just gets really dry. I just feel it literally go dry.
It might be the HVAC system in here.
It's like so.
It really cranks and it dries out the air a lot. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So distancing ourselves from the effects of our actions is something that we do quite often, right? We see this. This has been depicted in not only like slavery, but again, like in modern America, where I think of this for me as a systemic example of this would be redlining for me. To where we strip all of the BIPOC community from resources, right? And then white society lives on this other plane, right? It's almost like two worlds. It's been described as two worlds very, very often, right? And so where white people live outside of the harms that they are actually causing in society, where they don't systemically see on a daily basis what racism is doing. And the causes and the suffering of segregation and of stripping people of resources, right? It doesn't. If you don't see it in front of you, it's not going to as viscerally call out to you on an everyday basis. And the very often, or the very blatant truth is that white people do not see what the BIPOC community is going through on a daily basis to be able to actually be put in position to have compassion and empathy actually connected and drawn out of them, right? It's not only black people living in the quote unquote hood or the ghettos, right? It's also indigenous people living on reservations that are far away from white society and not having the everyday white citizen not having to question themselves about the well-being of other BIPOC communities in America.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and it's a deliberate kind of effect of the systems. Here we're talking about like the particularly kind of this throwing forward of institutional arrangements where you see it in the legal system, in the system of property ownership and lending, restrictive housing covenants and clauses that would say that you can't sell your house to a person of color, for instance, in many communities. It's an interesting article kind of recently in the New York Times that describes like how when people in any number of different neighborhoods and communities that are largely remain fairly unintegrated and homogeneously white enter into the sale of their house, will often discover that their deeds in their houses have these clauses in them,
right,
that are a legacy to an era where you could be kind of just nakedly, blandly embrace white supremacist values and not have any chance or any remorse or any need to justify or worry that you'll be called out on it. And so, that the whole system of separate but equal that emerged in the South after the abolition of slavery, it persists in so many different ways. And, people who are from higher socioeconomic backgrounds that correlate with whiteness and kind of privileged standing don't have to encounter the misery of America's like failing public health systems and infrastructure. You don't have to confront, the horrendous conditions, the environmental conditions and degradation of many communities, Native American communities of color, black communities, immigrant communities, where the physical circumstances of the kind of settings of housing expose people to routine health hazards that will take years off their lives in the form of kind of having pollution from nearby power plants that's relatively unregulated and unrestricted, Native American situations where there's been kind of contamination from mining operations undertaken on indigenous lands where there's been radioactivity, asbestos contamination in public spaces and housing and things like that. The way that the system is kind of like persisted and kept communities segregated allow persons of privilege, largely persons kind of white background, to kind of just go on in a kind of la la land without ever having to kind of see the impacts of this. And there's something that that about this kind of way of kind of turning away and of deliberately not looking into the problems that our lifestyles create, that feels like it's at the heart of so many different different crises that we face.
Right.
And it's very destructive. You see the parallel of it where it kind of ends up being magnified or supported in our media images, in our kind of like public spaces of discourse, in our shared social and historical realities, and the images of ourselves, of our society, the history that we teach our children in schools. And so, it's not attending to the kind of injustices, the impacts of our actions and things like that. How the way that America's treatment of indigenous communities unfolded in the course of colonization, the establishment of this country, the realities of slavery on a human level. It's extraordinary, kind of like how long in the mainstream education and social discourses, media, entertainment industries, how long the powerful forces in America that would kind of align with white supremacism kind of kept that imagery out, or tried to fence that imagery out. And honest, candid accounts from the perspective of members of many different communities and many vulnerable groups have really only started to be kind of tolerated and available and accessible on a kind of large scale level, probably since the formation of the internet and the diffusion of where it becomes possible to kind of like micro-publish, to organize on kind of local levels for communities of activism and advocacy, to start to kind of like do a richer body of work and bring it forward.
Bring it to light,
Yeah, this whole kind of debate over the teaching of critical race theory in schools right now that's unfolding is just, it's just more of the same as far as I can tell.
Right. Yeah, that confrontation with, again, kind of the life I'm living in white society, and then the BIPOC experience, right? And it being such a, in white society at least, such a contentious thing, because it sparks something. There's something that's going on internally, right? That leads to like this destabilization. And because we're confronted with kind of the inhumanity of this society that we're living in, but we don't actually think that we're a part of, because of the distance that we're putting, between ourselves and the people that are actually suffering. Another example of this would be, for me, like the legal system, right? And how that when it comes to the breakdown of how like mass incarceration happens, and how jurors are selected, and they bring forth a verdict from someone, right? And you never actually see that person, once you give the verdict, go through what they're going through, right? Yeah. It's really just kind of, okay, I give this verdict and then I wash my hands of it. The judge will then sentence the person after, right? And I don't have to be there for that part. I'm not really there for seeing that person go through all kind of the emotion and all these different things. And then even when it comes to like the death penalty, right? Like that at first was a very public thing, because it was supposed to a certain degree, like bring some sort of a humanity. But now it's become even more, it's gone away to a certain degree, but it's also now become more of a closet thing, because it sparks, there's something, again, that happens internally within us psychologically, watching a person die, especially after I sentence them as a juror or a judge, that we don't want really any a part of. Or even mass incarceration, are we actually going into the places where we're sending these people to? Yeah. Right, to see what their actual living conditions are, to see that there is no reformation inside of the reformation, process, rehabilitation process in jail. Right. They're just sitting there.
Yeah,
right?
The carceral system, the whole kind of like, it kind of, the camera stops at the door.
Right.
And to the degree that, that you can kind of find honest representations of the experience of being incarcerated, you have to seek them out. And, it won't be kind of like served up and placed in front of you. And that's how, the system gets to the place where we're at right now, where we have, the highest incarceration rates of almost any nation in the world. I think we are the
combined.
Highest. Yeah, like the highest by like several magnitudes. Yeah. It's like 5 times higher than the nearest nation. And that system, really grew and fed and gained its kind of its momentum and power through over a longer period of time, but through this process of kind of like of social neglect and of kind of desire to to put things out of sight, and putting things out of sight, keeping things out of sight is something that that as human beings we're all together too invested in, and it kind of makes it easy for us to then kind of turn our attention back or away and narrowly focus on what we think of as the things that are our responsibility and our business. The sense of one of the other ones that's on this list of mechanisms of moral disengagement would be diffusion of responsibility and displacement of responsibility.
Yeah.
So this occurs where we have systems in which in terms of diffusion of responsibility, in which the role of directly inflicting harms or witnessing harms and carrying out actions gets kind of split off or delegated to limited groups of individuals.
The parties
it's kind of like role specialization. Yeah. So there's interesting kind of research that's done on how people in different professions that have been called by sociologists violence workers. The experience of kind of like working in systems and in roles where you're carrying out directly and witnessing the violence of a broader kind of legal, social, economic system. And people who would be in, for instance, like in these roles that would be described as being violence workers would be police, law enforcement persons, persons serving as just like kind of guards in the correctional system, soldiers, military officers. There's a couple of other types of roles. And as you kind of like study the way that societies function, the responsibility for carrying out directly kind of actions that many people would find distasteful, or if they witnessed the results of it, they would feel deeply morally torn and troubled by, is kind of placed in the shoulders of specialized groups, and the kind of the well-being and adjustment of people in these roles is, we know, sometimes pretty precarious. And we know that, for instance, like for soldiers serving in active duty combat roles in any of the recent conflicts that the United States has taken part in, that there's very highly elevated rates of substance abuse, of depression, of
PTSD.
difficulty, disruption in people's social relationships, difficulty in adjusting back to civilian roles. There's PTSD. There's also something that's being written about and described in the clinical literature as alternately PITS, or sometimes called moral injury. Perpetration-induced traumatic stress or moral injury are two ways of kind of like thinking about something else that psychologists are becoming aware of, and kind of people working with folks who've been in these roles of where violence becomes a routine part of their lives or their professional responsibilities are dealing with. And this is a kind of a sickness or a pain that afflicts people who are placed in situations where they are exposed to, or they're kind of placed in situations where they act in ways that violate some deeper sense of their moral conscience and their sense of kind of like of right or wrong, or what's appropriate or not appropriate. And the pressures, one thing that we know from looking at like a lot of experimental and social psych literature is that individuals are very, very vulnerable to authority pressures, to social pressures, to the expectations of groups, powerful groups and others around them in terms of our behavior. And if we're put in a situation where we have somebody who we perceive as possessing some sort of legitimate knowledge and authority and is in a kind of supervisory role over us that we've assented to and we've kind of agreed to, and we're surrounded by a group of peers who are willing to step forward into an action or a situation where they may end up carrying out kind of action that they may regret, that may lead to, the death of civilians in a drone strike, or in an attempt to serve a warrant against somebody, or kind of enter into a situation where there might be domestic violence. Something bad could happen on a particular instance, and somebody who we don't want to get hurt might get hurt. If you're placed in that situation and you're kind of in those roles, there's a vulnerability to just kind of carry out and do your duty, and it's your responsibility, and the expectations of those around you are really powerful. And often people will end up in situations where they've done things that as they step back from them and they make a transition back into their kind of non-professional roles and identities, as they demobilize and come back home from a foreign war or situation, that now they're kind of looking back over things, and they're asking questions, and they're seeing their actions and asking, wait a minute, why did that happen? And what was my role and responsibility? And they'll find themselves suffering from what could be reflected as kind of maybe post-traumatic stress disorder, where they're having flashbacks that carry a really powerful, painful, emotional charge, and find kind of very disruptive of their sense of well-being, where they find themselves not able to get good sleep. They're having nightmares, intrusive memories. They find themselves wanting to avoid things that remind them of the situation that they encountered. But in this case, sometimes people will find themselves reminded of these situations where they made a mistake, or they did something that in retrospect feels wrong to them. It violated their sense of rightness and order. And these persons suffer real psychological distress and pain, and the vulnerability to then do things like, kind of drink or use substances to kind of numb out and control those feelings, to get some sense of kind of control back into their life, or to manage all of the other stresses in their world. They may have real difficulties around this. So recognizing that there's both, something like post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's also this phenomenon of kind of like moral injury. And that would suggest actually something a little bit more optimistic than Bandura's account, and this idea that we have these mechanisms of moral disengagement that we can turn on, and we can flip a switch almost with language, or the way that we're framing, thinking, and talking about our actions, and we can kind of shut ourselves down morally, or kind of like deny the humanity of others without it kind of like exacting a cost. And so the reality of the difficulty that people experience when they're in these situations and try and kind of move back into their lives suggests that we don't have absolute control over that. And in fact, in many situations, despite the fact that we're trying to use these mechanisms of moral disengagement, and we have kind of excuses ready at the hand, and the dehumanizing rhetoric, and the ways of kind of dismissing ourselves, or saying, I was just doing my job, or it's really probably somebody else's responsibility to take that action. Still, people are troubled, and there's some part of our kind of consciousness and conscience that is strong, that kicks in, that responds to particularly those types of situations where we're face-to-face with others and have like reminders and a grounding in their humanity. And if we carry out actions of violence, immorality, or brutality in those types of visceral, embodied, face-to-face situations, it's very hard for people to psychologically shut down and flee the consequences or deny that knowledge. And that's optimistic. For me, that's like an avenue into a possibility for change and for kind of making things different.
Right. Yeah. And so if I'm understanding you correctly, and first there's like this kind of recognition, or there's this push and this pull of like, is this my responsibility, right?
Yeah.
There's this kind of general question, right? And for a lot of society, especially particularly again in this conversation of racism, but in white society, there is this question of, is this my responsibility or not to act to these things, right? To be able to get drawn into this whole kind of racial diffusion of the United States, right? And that's a very big question to ask, right? But on a societal level, at least, that's a very big question to ask. And oftentimes, like that, because we are such a kind of, our society permeates individuals so powerfully, I feel like there is kind of this thought that sometimes I'm too small to actually bring about change on an individual level, right? not only as a white person, but I can also say for myself as a BIPOC person, like there is this kind of ingrained kind of thing inside of me, this doubt that says, I don't know if I actually like can make a change. And that also kind of diffuses my responsibility to a certain degree, because I'm like, like, is it really my responsibility to react? Well, okay, there's some room there to have an argument, like morally and kind of ethically there, more importantly, like, should I respond? And then also kind of like you're talking about here of like we are not actually bred to commit violence to one another, that there is actual real ramifications to ourselves psychologically, emotionally, physically if we commit violence to other people. If on a societal level, it's something that we actually don't explore very often, right? Because it's maybe you know a little bit more about this, but I think of the premise of veterans hospitals versus actual having general hospitals, and that kind of like displacement of peoples, right? To where we can't necessarily see what goes on in either, right? And what I would imagine is, and obviously I've done some research on this a little bit, but like we can see is like you're talking about there of like people that are in these positions where they're committing real violence, that there is real cost. PTSD, as you're talking about, depression, anxiety, being in like an actual, they're degrading in their kind of psychological states because of the violence that was harm that they carried out or they were a part of in some way. But then also at the very kind of last part of what you're talking about here is that there is also this kind of draw to actually like kind of push up against, if we sit with like these people on like a more intimate level and we really question like what's going on, like that we actually can respond in a compassionate and more empathetic way. But it's just so very often that because there are so many kind of these diffusion mechanisms happening in our society, permeating our society, that we are not confronted with that, even that question, the existence of that question itself, that I can actually inevitably do something to change this system.
Yeah, and that feeling of kind of like that judgment about, can I do something to change this? Is this my responsibility? Is kind of at the crux of it. And we've got this weird kind of set of social arrangements where our society kind of like, we've specified roles for individuals, and the responsibility for taking care of that person over there who is malnourished and their health is in jeopardy. They don't have housing. They seem to have kind of distress and kind of have some sort of emotional or difficulty in their lives. Well, that's a social worker's responsibility. Right. That's the responsibility of a charity that works and feeds. And my role might be to donate some money to to those groups that are doing that work. Or if you have vets who are coming back who are carrying a burden of kind of like trauma and confusion arising out of the situations that they were in, the decisions that they had to make, and what they were confronted with, then that's the doctor at the VA's responsibility. What is my role here? And over again, we have this way of kind of like our society offers us these kind of roles, and it feels like in many situations it's never my role. I mean, it's my role to go out and and kind of like vote for somebody running for Congress who's actually going to support extending the Voting Rights Act and protections for basic for persons of color's vote to be counted and registered in the electoral process. That's a role that I know and I can acknowledge, and I'll step into it. But in many other situations, there's that kind of bewilderment of, well, what is my role here and what is my place here? And having the guidance and the ability of kind of the support of others to kind of say like, no, you do have a role here, and there is something you can do, and here's a way to do it. And you can join me in doing this, or there's a group you can connect up with. We're social beings, and fundamentally have this kind of sense of kind of needing to be with one another and be in relationship with one another and our actions, and have our judgments kind of like confirmed by others around us. And this can both work for us in terms of like kind of promoting good outcomes and social work and engagement with injustices, or it can work against us. These mechanisms of moral disengagement and letting ourselves off the hook, using euphemisms and denial, all these kinds of things, we can turn towards others who have kind of assented to this and are very happy to kind of use all of these, and to remind us that that's not our responsibility, and you never did that, and you're not responsible for what your ancestors did, and I don't believe that that people really suffered under slavery, for instance. You'll hear the most kind of amazing things if you just like kind of scratch into it. But we're social beings, and we're looking for kind of reference to kind of affirm what we're seeing, what we're feeling, what our choices are, what our agency and possibility is. So it's so powerful that just having one other person in the situation with you who echoes and can reaffirm what you're thinking or what your conscience might be telling you about what you need to do here, about something being your responsibility, and not shedding it off and saying, no, not mine, not mine to carry. Having just like one other person in the surroundings when we're confronted with those dilemmas or choices is really enormously powerful. And the other point that struck me as you were talking just a moment ago was there's a strange circumstance where we're, as human beings, we're embodied. We would say, and there's a lot of kind of writing and studying of the phenomena of embodiment now in psychology and in a lot of different areas. And that's just kind of referring to the idea that that we exist kind of physically in our bodies, and we're kind of bound to our experiences of our senses and kind of like subtle forms of perception. So what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, what I'm noticing physically around me in this space impacts me far more than what I hear about as a rumor or a communication that may come to me, kind of in a text message or through a kind of thin channel of somebody's, kind of description or account of it. And what we find is that tendency for people to actually feel a kind of a pull of empathy, a call to assume responsibility and to respond to the pain that another human being is suffering, and to carry that responsibility and burden and acknowledge that, that I have a role here. I have a role in, perhaps in causing the pain and distress of this other person or this group, and I have a responsibility to take some step to try and help and to heal. That depends upon our kind of like being present to that experience. And when we're present and when we're getting the feedback from our eyes, from our senses, from we're hearing and we're taking in another person's experience as they're going through something, that's so much more powerful than just kind of hearing about it in a distance form. To the extent that there was this famous studies that Stanley Milgram did at Yale University, that a lot of your listeners might be familiar with, where he had brought people into a laboratory and had them, in effect, ask them to give shocks to somebody who was doing a memory and learning task. And he would eventually, kind of escalate the level of shock that the experimental subject was being asked to give, to the point where they had every reason to believe that they would be permanently harming or perhaps killing the person that they were shocking. And large numbers of random people brought in would give the most lethal and dangerous and painful forms of shocks to people, except that started to vary, and the willingness of people to carry out those instructions, as you kind of gave them more direct feedback and a kind of like embodied sense of the pain that person that they're shocking might be suffering, by moving them from a distant room where you're only getting audio feedback and you're hearing this person's voice screaming, "Let me out, let me out. I told you my heart was bothering me. Let me out, let me out." When you're just hearing their voice, versus bringing them into the same physical space where you can actually see them across the room, screaming and flailing and saying those same words.
Powerful.
You see large numbers of people won't give those shocks when they're witnessing, and it's full tangible way, the impacts of their action on another human being. And when you actually put them, Milgram did this, the ethics of this were very, very dubious, but he literally had a condition where he had the experimental subjects would be pressing the hand of the person who was receiving the shock down upon the shock plate, wearing insulated gloves, and the person who was an actor would then be feigning this reaction to the shocks, and the experimental subject would be required to physically press them into contact. Almost nobody would carry through with that procedure when they were in an embodied way being required to facilitate literally forcing this person's hand onto a shock plate, and harming them in that manner. And likewise, almost nobody would carry forward with giving the shocks, even when they were only getting the audio feedback and hearing the voice in the next room. When they had one other person in the room with them who said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not right. This person is suffering. We're hurting this person. When they had only one person to support them in their moral instinct and intuition that this is wrong, then most of the people brought into the situation found the power to resist and to say to this person in the white lab coat who's telling them, you must continue with this, and you agreed to do this, now administer the shock. They would muster up the resolve, if they have one person supporting them, to say, no, I'm done, and to walk away from that. And so, there's a lot of different lessons about, just kind of like how we might work to help kind of like connect people up to and empower their moral conscience and intuition, their capacity for empathy, and to actually, kind of support action on that basis. But the other take-home lesson from all of this, and from a large part of our discussion today, is that persons, if we're isolated within a group or within a society that is devaluing and denying our intuitions and kind of giving us a way to dehumanize and dismiss our kind of gut instincts, then altogether too often we'll take it, and we won't step up. We'll step back and step into line with all kinds of abusive, coercive, destructive systems. And that kind of rounding back, that gets to that question of how are there so many white people who, kind of don't feel like it's their responsibility, or can't step forward, or don't know how to step forward, or who are willing to kind of like echo the denials, the diffusion of responsibility, and kind of support some of these arrangements. Right.
Yeah, I think that everything that you're talking about, kind of the getting closer to, right? That, like you're talking about, that embodied kind of sense of getting up close and personal, right? Yeah. Actually being in the room, or being on the street, or being in that classroom, or whatever it may be, to see the impact of this kind of societal system weighing on, the oppressed people.
Yeah, and when you get to know somebody, it's like even more powerful than just like kind of like, okay, the embodied thing is like really powerful. But what if this person who's suffering and and kind of having this violence inflicted on them is someone that I actually know? I know your name. I know your partner. I've sat down. I've eaten with you. I kind of have laughed at your jokes and shared moments with you, and been witness to things in your family and your life that I feel a connection to you. Then your tolerance for this dehumanizing kind of attitude is going to evaporate really fast.
Yeah.
And and under those circumstances, human beings can be relied upon to respond with real moral conscience.
Right.
But how to kind of like bridge those distances and create that sense of humanity and connection it just feels like it's something this nation has struggled with, and still struggles with, on just such a profound and basic level.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's the crux of it all, right? Like that question of, again, like the diffusion of responsibility. Is it my position to actually do it? And then also like sitting in that weight of like, okay, like what do I do, right? Like there's not much work on like an actual level to like tell you what it is that you need to do, but or we overcomplicate it, right? Which happens quite a bit. But I really think that it comes down to kind of psychologically at first, like you're talking about, literally just like, I mean, we talked about this analogy before, and I've written about it a little bit, but like the Matrix analogy, right? Of like they're, you know, if you want to talk about Morpheus is that person that is with you to kind of awaken you up from this kind of stupor that you've been in, this fake reality, right, of Neo's.
The numbed reality of kind of like all of the dissociative moral distancing,
Right.
diffusion of responsibility, disengagement. Yeah.
Right. And then to consciously make that decision as Neo was faced with the choice of, you know, I remember him actually having just a moment where he realizes that he gets brief hints that what he's living in is not actually real.
Yep.
Right. And then he decided to take a risk that those hints that he was given, those perceptions of society being not what he thought it was enough to then jump into this world that he didn't really know, that was full of fear and kind of ambiguity, but like he faced it head on. And we have this choice kind of, you know, as individuals, right? Both outside of America, but particularly here in in America and for white people, of like, which pill are you going to take?
Yeah.
Are you going to take?
Yeah, take the blue pill, or
Right.
you know the red pill, which is going to carry with it,
Right.
you know, all manner of kind of troubling, disturbing perceptions and a reality that's gonna ask you, it's
Right.
gonna demand that you step forward and do something. You can try and reinsert yourself into the Matrix, you know, a la the character,
Right.
with Cypher. I can't remember.
Going back to the stake.
Yeah, I want to go back into the Matrix and you know, and kind of take the pill again. But you know, in some sense, in some ways, that doesn't work. That doesn't work really well once you start to kind of like see the reality of the abuses and the pain and the injustice and the kind of deeper threads that run through all this. I don't know if people really have an option at that point to exit. You can try and numb out to it, but
Right. Yeah. You know, I think that again, like you're kind of saying, like once you're awakened to this world, it's kind of asking that, you know, all these questions come up. What do I do?
Yeah.
How can I act? And like, you know, I think what I would say is just, you have to be vulnerable first, right? That's where it all starts. You have to be vulnerable enough to one, take the pill, and then secondly, like actually stay in that place. And as we saw, like so viscerally, like with Neo in the Matrix, like his body rejected like that first kind of taste of the real air because it was so visceral. It was such a destabilizing, you know, place to be in. But once he kind of woke up, right, and came to, like he realized that he had strength to be able to move about in this place, that reality was yes, a little bit more painful, but also there was this sweetness, this gentleness, this loving nature of being able to actually like serve all of these people that were in abundance there, and actually being able to see society as it is, but also then be able to have hope for the future, for transformation, and to see that come about is such a powerful thing.
Yeah. And in the Matrix as well, one thing that as you're talking really jumps out is this like the possibility of real human connection and community. For Neo in that movie, you know, it's not there in the Matrix anywhere in his world. You know, he is you know, part of the pain of kind of like living in this kind of system is the distance that it kind of imposes on us, and the way that it divides us from one another, or the way that it kind of bleeds into our kind of just the possibility of kind of caring and connection to one another, or to a kind of sense of kind of human connection and possibility. Right. And you know, we're diminished to the extent that we assent and we allow ourselves to kind of stay embedded in these systems, just to the degree that, you know, that we're willing to kind of take the difficult step and start to acknowledge and start to connect with one another and hear about and bear witness to the reality of the lives, the pain, the difficult circumstances of people around us. Then there's a possibility for something different, for something more real, something more connected, and that means, you know, kind of shedding some level of comfort.
Right.
That's not really comfort. It's just kind of numbness and
Right.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the more comfortable thing I think is, yeah, is there. I mean, ignorance is bliss, like they say,
Yeah.
to a certain degree, right? But the real comfort I think comes with, kind of this honing of this community of
Yeah.
like actually like getting down into that work and actually grappling with the immensity and the ambiguity of the whole system, but being like looking around and being like, I'm not alone.
Yeah.
I'm not alone in this movement, and wow, what such beautiful people I have been missing out on
Yeah.
in my whole entire life.
Yeah, it's the creation of a beloved community,
Yeah.
to use King's words, and that sense of that there is work to be done, and urgent work to be done, and so much as we are willing to do it and to take up that task, then our lives are kind of rich and can be filled with a sense of kind of meaning and grounding.
Right.
That if we kind of deny it, if we try and shed that awareness of burden, everything ends up kind of thin and half real. And it's like, the Matrix, everything is shot in the Matrix, with that kind of half light tinged yellowish green filter that's just like so oppressive to watch. It's like, just being in that space visually, you get that, it gives a good feeling for the unease that we feel. And I think that a lot of us feel right now.
Yeah.
Kind of in our world, and is a sense of like deep distress and unease at the directions and the momentum of where our kind of politics and history are carrying us, and that if we don't act to correct and turn and create a different human community, we're going under.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I just want to thank you first and foremost for having this conversation. I think, being a white man in the first place, like it's powerful to see you have this conversation as someone that I've seen kind of stay in the grief and kind of in this kind of, again, community, just the community work that it takes to be able to do this kind of stuff and to be able to like have difficult conversations and to be able to do the work internally, to be able to like say, I am a part of this system, but also like I can do something about it. And I think that has been such an inspiration for me, not only in the program, Seattle U program for psychology, but just as a human being and sharing space with you. And Dr. LeBeau, who I would love to share one thing she gave me. Dr. LeBeau is another professor in the Seattle University program for psychology, and she gave me a paper by George Yancey, who is a black philosopher, and he kind of writes this paper. It's called Tarrying Together, in a response to some of the things that he was going through and kind of some of the questions that he had for white society. And he says, to white people, he says, the call demands that white people dwell with the emotional and cognitive dissonance that will be inevitably experienced as they become more and more attentive to the ways in which they are entangled in the social and psychic web of white racism. It is the dissonance and the sense of crisis that results from the awareness of the gravity of such an entanglement that must be endured and confronted. It is not about seeing how much guilt one can sustain or endure. And that kind of what he's saying there is that it is about slowing down. It's about seeing ourselves inside of these different mechanisms of violence. Not, again, for me as a BIPOC person, it still applies, but particularly for this conversation of racism, we're talking about white society and how slowing down, sitting with the discomfort, sitting with the dissonance can really provide, that's the first step for transfusion and change. So again, thank you so much, sir, for being here. With your presence. It's been a profound conversation, and I hope that the viewers were able to take something from it. And I honestly would advise listening to it a couple times if you have the time, because there is a lot that we covered. But most importantly, just thank you for your time, and thank you for the viewers listening to this kind of riveting episode. There was a lot to deal with. Follow us on Instagram, Race Relations Podcast, or find us on our website, www.racerelationspodcast.com. We're also on Spotify as well, Race Relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Caleb. Always.